do a brief overview of what are the economic impacts of EU enlargement on the new EU member countries, I decided to organize the overview into 4 parts. First, as, let's say, economists would look into the GDP growth or to identify somehow the growth effects. And as Dr. Michal said, they're quite clear. Okay. Then we'll look into economic convergence, integration via the internal market, and then we'll finish with something more sophisticated, but personally I find it the most interesting part maybe, the economic complexity and the innovation in EU member countries. I focus on the Visegrad countries. I must say my presentation is only graphs and tables, but I will guide you through that, so I hope you'll not be lost. And in the discussion part, if you have any question, feel free to ask. Okay, so we'll start with the growth effects. This table is quite big, but I will guide you through that. Every 2 rows, they relate to an enlargement. Okay, so if we go back to enlargement in 2004, we have a column for the EU 15, then we have the EU 28, but we'll tend to ignore that. And we'll look into the statistics for the enlargement. So these are the EU 10, which entered the EU in 2004. And we have the GDP growth rate. We have, it's not the yearly GDP growth rate because that would be huge, but it's GDP growth in 5 years. Okay, so how did the real GDP growth in 5 years before the accession and after the accession? Of course, we have the question, where does the year 2004 fit into? Because the accession, the enlargement was in May, but I decided to include it in the year after the accession. Okay, but that's subject to discussion. So if we look into the old member states and the new member states, okay, in terms of real GDP growth, why real GDP? To get rid of the inflation rate, okay, to make sure that the data is not impacted by the inflation rate. So for the 2004 enlargement, we have quite clear growth effects. Okay, if we compare it to the old member countries, the EU 15, then the new member countries experienced a much higher GDP growth after the accession. Of course, here we are mixing 2 effects. We have the catch-up effects, which means that by default, countries with a lower economic level, they would be increasing quicker than richer countries. But there is also the question, maybe these catch-up effects are enhanced by the EU accession. Okay, so we're mixing 2 effects here. If we wanted to be more systematic, we should split them, but in this table, it's actually both, the growth effects and the catch-up effects. If we move to the next enlargement, where the, let's say the benchmark year is 2007, then we see that, okay, the growth rate before and after accession for Bulgaria and Romania decreased a lot, but you probably guessed that there is the effect of the economic crisis here. Okay, so even though we have a decrease in the real GDP increased growth, growth rates, it still remains in positive values, while for the EU 15 it's actually negative. Okay, again, it's real GDP, not nominal GDP. Okay, so we might speak about some GDP growth effects here as well. And for Croatia, I would say the statistics is quite clear. While before accession, the real GDP decreased for the 5 years before, after the accession, it increased by 20 percentage points. Okay, so for the GDP growth effects, I think it's quite clear, although here, of course, the economic crisis is included. Okay, so we are mixing again more effects here. On this graph, we have the member countries which entered the EU after 2004, and I want to focus on the Visegrad countries just to show that we have heterogeneity. Okay, we have differences. The dark columns are the real GDP growth 5 years before the accession, and the whiter ones is data after the accession. So for all V4 countries, we have growth effects, except Hungary. So one takeaway here would be that the country context is important. For Hungary, the explanation would be the financial austerity following the, or maybe around the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and the high government debt, which led to a lower GDP growth. Okay, so it's not true that by definition any member country would benefit. The country context is also important. Okay, it would reduce the growth effects. If we move to economic convergence, let's say the first indicator that would be used to measure that would be the GDP per capita. To be consistent with the previous part, I went for the real GDP per capita because we have quite a long time frame, so to make sure that inflation doesn't impact the result. And I also have only the Visegrad countries, okay, to have a more clear picture just for our region. And this is the expansion period. In the long run, we can speak about convergence. Okay, what is the y-axis measuring? It's measuring what is the ratio of the GDP per capita of specific countries as a ratio of the EU 15 level. Okay, so the best position belongs to the Czech Republic, this orange one, and currently before COVID, the Czech Republic had the GDP per capita at 80% of the EU 15 level, which is not so bad. Okay, so typically we see historically the Czech Republic is the best performer, followed by Hungary, Poland, Slovakia. I would say the second best performer in terms of rate, the increase, is Poland, because now it's ranking second in the V4, and the starting point was not the best one. Okay, that might be in line with how these countries are able to absorb the EU funds and so on, because when looking into that, actually Poland and the Czech Republic rank best in the V4 countries, and Poland and Slovakia, they are the last ones. And that might be translated into the poorer convergence rates. That might be a reason. If we look into the integration by the internal market, this is just a picture trying to show, to visualize how did the size of the EU market increase. Okay, so I have three measures for that. The columns are measuring the size of the market as a population or employment, like the workforce, and this curve captures the real GDP, again, in constant prices to get rid of the inflation rate. No matter what is the measure, we clearly see that the size of the EU market increased. Of course, these steps are caused, as you probably guessed, by the enlargement waves. Okay? How important were the enlargement waves? Here I'm, again, using the same measures, population, employment, and real GDP in constant prices. And I have the values for each enlargement wave. The takeaway from this table is that the EU 10 enlargement in 2004 was the second largest one, and the first one was, the biggest one was actually the first enlargement when the UK entered the EEC at that time. The second takeaway is that despite this being the second largest enlargement in terms of population and workforce, actually in terms of GDP the ratio is lower. Because these countries were poorer, many of them were former communist countries, so in terms of GDP, they did not increase the single market by so much. But I sometimes call it a two-way effect or win-win, because also the EU member countries, they also experienced an increase in the single market size by adopting these new member countries. Okay. In economics, if we want to measure, let's say, the single market effect, one way to do it is to, we have many ways to do it. Here I decided to go for the so-called trade diversion, which means that if you are provided preferential trade liberalization by somebody, a country or a group of countries, by definition, you would be trading more with those trade partners. Okay, so on this graph, I have the ratio of imports from the EU 28 by, the orange ones are the imports to the Visegrad countries, this one, You see that it's actually copying the ratio for the EU 10, so they are very similar in this sense. And then we have the EU 2, Romania, Bulgaria, and we have Croatia, which seems to be the most volatile, country. And the y-axis is measuring which ratio of the total imports comes from the EU 28. And if we look, let's say, for example, at the Visegrad countries in 2022, what we see that is approximately, 68% of imports come from the EU. If we look at the enlargement years, I will just disclose this one, then I will disclose the other ones, then we probably see a certain trade diversion in imports, because the ratio of imports from the EU increased from, I don't know, 66% to 72%, 73%, okay? So imports from the EU increased as a result of liberalization. It actually happened quite in advance because companies, importers, exporters, they tend to also react to signals of the market. So expecting that the enlargement would happen, they could adjust already the trade partners, the structures, okay? So it's not surprising that actually the effect can be observed before, okay, in advance. Then we have the next enlargement years, but of course the result for the EU too were impacted also by the financial crisis, so maybe it's not so convincing here. For Croatia, the trade diversion is quite convincing, first because the levels before the accession were quite low, so I would say the reserve was quite high. There was space for trade diversion. Trade diversion in terms of exports to the EU might not be so convincing, because if we look at the ratio, no matter what is the expansion wave, they seem to be at least stagnating. But what would be the explanation? First, the rates are already high, so economists say that the market was already saturated, okay? Maybe it's not reasonable to export more of 80% to the EU. You need a certain diversification of the markets, okay? So that would be one reason. The second reason would be that actually this diversification was actually supported by the EU trade policy. As the new member countries, they adopted the EU trade policy, diversification and trade in terms of export markets to non-EU member countries such as China, Russia, was actually easier, okay? So we don't observe clear trade diversion effects if we measure them by exports, but there are reasons for that, okay? It's not that the integration failed, there were other reasons behind that. And here we just close up this topic, this section by looking into the trade balances, which is exports minus imports. I have just the Visegrad countries, so the reference year will be 2004. And the takeaway is that in most cases, the V countries, they have a positive trade balance with the EU, meaning that they export more to the EU than they import. The outlier here is Slovakia. For some reason, Slovak trade is not so competitive for the EU market as for other V4 countries. Maybe another interesting country is Poland, which went a long way from negative, consistent negative trade balances to positive trade balances since 2014. The final section would look into economic complexity and innovation. I personally find economic complexity a very interesting topic. If you want to, let's say, know more about how is it calculated, we can discuss it in the discussion section. What we have here is the ranking of the V4 countries according to the economic complexity. The complexity is calculated based on, let's say, there is a methodology behind that, and the output is measuring the sophistication of the country's exports, okay, how sophisticated they are, and let's say a car will be more sophisticated than potatoes. I don't know if I keep it simple. So the Czech Republic is ranking surprisingly well. I would say most economists, when they see this for the first time, they're also surprised. Okay? And this can be explained by the fact that the Czech Republic is a small open country and the manufacturing sector is quite strong, so that results in this good ranking. Currently, it's ranking amongst 6, 7s, which is a good ranking. And the last one is Poland. Slovakia is somehow in the middle. Okay, so we have a certain heterogeneity in terms of country ranking. But still, worldwide, okay, the number of countries is, in the statistics is 144, I think. So they still rank in the first quartile, okay? No matter what is the performance, they're still good performance. But we have some heterogeneity across V4 countries. Why do we have these differences? Well, we have different innovation policies, different extent of investment in research and development, different specializations, so the result looks like this. Can the EU membership improve or help the country complexity? Yes, through the absorption of the EU funds, through let's say, investing more or supporting companies which are more innovative, through some like targeted industrial policy. Okay, so theoretically and practically, the EU membership can improve the economic complexity and, let's say, the ranking of the EU member countries. The last graph I will show you is the government expenditure on research and development, and typically, because we have different country sizes, it's usual to divide it by the GDP. Okay, these are the data for the V countries again. Historically, the Czech Republic is again the best performer. However, it's still below the EU average and below the this EU strategy 2020. It declared a value of 3%. None of the V4 countries reached that value. Okay, the Czech Republic is the best performer in the region, but it's still quite low compared to the EU levels. The worst performer is Slovakia. For some reason, let's say the government expenditure on research and development is lower than 1%, and that raises serious issues about the, let's say, future development of this country in the global value chains and so on. Okay, that is the expansion year. Okay, to summarize, I would say, as Professor Michal said in the beginning, the economic effects are quite clear. Okay, if we take it purely economically, integration into the EU makes sense. Economically, it's a win-win, or at least for the new member countries. We have clear growth effects. Of course, the country context is important, but still the growth effects are quite clear. Also, we have convergence effects. It comes with a certain delay, but okay, the convergence is still happening. The access to single market is also bringing benefits to the EU member countries as well. In the presentation, I measured it through the size of the market and trade, but also we can look into the prices in the manufacturing sector, or we have different measures, and it doesn't matter to which measure do we take, the effects are still positive. Okay. In terms of trade integration, we do observe a certain trade diversion towards the EU member countries, and where we don't see it, it has some reasons, okay, some economic reasons. In terms of competitiveness and innovation gaps, I would say this is the biggest issue with the new EU member countries. Again, in the presentation, I included just 2 measures, okay, how to assess it. But we can also look into the ratio of high-tech manufacturing, own manufacturing. We can look into patenting activities, how many patents are issued, divided by the number of inhabitants. And no matter what is the reason, the new member countries, they seem to, they have poor results. Okay, so we need more targeted industrial policies and more investment into research and development to improve the performance in this aspect. In terms of economic complexity, again, the results are mixed. The V4 countries, they rank well, but probably the potential could be higher if enhanced properly. Okay, that would be all from my side. And if you have any additional questions, I would be happy to address them in the discussion section.